In the mid-1980s, a young Patricia Stallings lived in Jefferson County, Missouri, where she worked at a convenience store. In 1986, she would end up meeting a man named David, and the pair were married in 1988. They were excited to start their new lives by having a family together and moving into their dream home, a small white house overlooking a large lake. They wasted no time, and in April of the next year, Patricia gave birth to their son, Ryan. Everything seemed perfect, until the evening of July 7th, 1989, when 3-month-old Ryan began vomiting and wasn't able to keep his food down. Over the next few days, Patricia noticed that he became more lethargic and his breathing increasingly laboured. As a concerned new mother, Patricia took Ryan to the Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital in St. Louis, where he was immediately admitted to the pediatric intensive care unit. Doctors ran a series of tests on Ryan to try to figure out what was making him so unwell, and they were surprised with what they discovered. Ryan had extremely high levels of ethylene glycol, the main ingredient in antifreeze, in his blood. Doctors assumed the only way he could have that much of the toxin in his system was if he had been poisoned, and they were obligated to contact the Missouri Division of Family Services. Little Ryan was immediately placed into protective custody while the police investigated the circumstances around his sudden illness. During a search of the Stallings' home, the police found a gallon container of antifreeze in the basement and seized it as evidence. Just 10 days after he was admitted into the hospital, Ryan was discharged straight into a foster home. It wouldn't be until September 1st that Patricia Stallings was allowed a short, supervised visit with her son, where she fed him his bottle. A few days later, on the 4th of September, Ryan was again admitted into the hospital after he began vomiting and hyperventilating, just like he had before. He was treated again for ethylene glycol poisoning, but unfortunately, he would not survive. The police immediately arrested Patricia at her home, and she was not told about the death of her son until she was in custody. Tests would reveal traces of ethylene glycol in Ryan's baby bottle, the same one that Patricia had used to feed him during her supervised visit, and an autopsy uncovered crystals of calcium oxalate in Ryan's brain, which is a typical sign of ethylene glycol poisoning. The police charged Patricia with murder and assault, and prosecutors publicly admitted that they were considering seeking the death penalty in this case. While she spent the next few months in jail awaiting trial and still grieving the loss of her son, Patricia discovered that she was pregnant with her second child. Soon after, in February 1990, she gave birth to her second son, David Jr., while she was still in prison, and he was immediately placed into protective custody. Despite being in a foster home and having zero contact with his biological parents, David Jr. soon began exhibiting the same kind of symptoms that his brother Ryan had before his death. But there was no way that David Jr. had been poisoned. So doctors at the St. Louis Children's Hospital ran extensive tests on him until they were finally able to diagnose him with methylmalonic acidemia, or MMA. MMA is a group of rare genetic disorders that stops the body from being able to properly digest and break down specific fats and proteins, which leads to unmetabolized byproducts building up in the blood. The accumulation of toxins causes damage to the brain, liver, and other organs that progressively gets worse, leading to symptoms such as lethargy, trouble breathing, kidney failure, and seizures. While the disorder is rare in that it only occurs in about 1 in 50,000 births, it can often be fatal or significantly reduce the individual's lifespan. In David Jr.'s case, his body wasn't able to break down some of the nutrients within the milk he was being fed due to a missing protein. However, because his diagnosis came early enough, his diet was able to be modified before the toxic substances could make him more unwell. With a clearer understanding of David Jr.'s condition, it becomes easier to explain what had happened to Ryan to cause his tragic death. However, Even with the knowledge of David Jr.'s diagnosis, prosecuting attorney George McElroy decided to go ahead with the first-degree murder charges against Patricia Stallings. At trial, the state had an expert testify that a diagnosis of MMA still wouldn't have been able to explain the presence of ethylene glycol in Ryan's blood, and that he ultimately died of antifreeze poisoning. Prosecutor McElroy even told the jury, quote, "Don't try to understand why Patricia Stallings poisoned her child by feeding him from a baby bottle laced with antifreeze. The point is she did it. Only she could have done it." Despite being fully aware of David Jr.'s hereditary genetic condition and how it could have contributed to Ryan's death, Patricia's defense attorney failed to present their own scientific expert to the jury to explain the connection or to question the state's lab's results. She was soon found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. However, there were still lingering doubts about Patricia's guilt. Her husband, David, continued to campaign on her behalf and was able to persuade the producers of the popular TV show Unsolved Mysteries to feature Patricia's case in an episode. The episode aired in May 1991, just a few months after she was found guilty. As fate would have it, Dr. William Sly, a professor and chairman for the Department of Biochemistry at St. Louis University, had watched the Unsolved Mysteries episode and was very interested in the case. Dr. Sly and his colleague Dr. James Shoemaker decided to run further tests on Ryan's blood in order to prove whether or not ethylene glycol poisoning had caused his death. The two discovered that the original testing had not been done using the correct methods, so Dr. Sly and Dr. Shoemaker retested the blood via gas chromatography mass spectrometry, which is a way of separating, identifying, and quantifying complex mixtures of chemicals. The results of the new testing confirmed that baby Ryan had suffered from MMA. But this still wasn't enough evidence for prosecutor George McElroy to drop the charges against Patricia Stallings. So, they conducted some more testing and realised that the labs that had processed the original sample of Ryan's blood had made a shocking error. Dr. Sly and Dr. Shoemaker knew that one of the substances that can build up in the bloodstream of someone suffering from MMA is propionic acid, and it can easily be mistaken for ethylene glycol, a mistake the original lab had unknowingly made. Prosecutor McElroy needed to hear this evidence from an expert that was not associated with the case, so he approached Dr. Piero Rinaldo, a respected geneticist working at Yale University. After reviewing all of the data, Dr. Rinaldo agreed with Dr. Sly and Dr. Shoemaker's determination that Ryan had died from MMA. He explained that he had found zero evidence of ethylene glycol in Ryan's baby bottle, and that there was a high likelihood that the crystallization found in Ryan's brain was directly caused by the ethanol drip that had been administered to him in hospital in an attempt to treat the suspected ethylene glycol poisoning. Prosecutor McElroy was finally convinced. 2 years after Patricia Stallings had first been arrested, on September 19, 1991, she was released from prison and all charges against her were dismissed. She was finally free to reunite with her husband and surviving son, to begin to grieve for the loss of her firstborn child, and to figure out a way to manage David Jr.'s new MMA diagnosis. Patricia and her husband David filed lawsuits against the hospital that had dealt with Ryan's care and the laboratories that had got his diagnosis wrong. They received out-of-court settlements, however, this likely failed to make up for the trauma the family had experienced. There was only a 1 in 4 chance that David Jr. would have inherited the same disorder as his brother, Ryan. If he had been born healthy, would doctors have ever uncovered the hereditary disease? Would Patricia Stallings still be in prison? Thanks to the dedication of a few biochemists, justice prevailed and important lessons were learned. And most significantly, David Jr.'s swift diagnosis meant that doctors were able to minimize the symptoms of his MMA, which allowed him to live a relatively normal life until he died in 2013 at age 23.